and welcome to the Broken Warriors Guide to Books. I'm Kirsten and I'm going to be doing a review today of the book Snake Ropes by Jess Richards, which is a book I absolutely love and I'm going to be mainly raving about. I'm going to try to avoid spoilers as much as I can, because one of the beauties of this book is the way that the secrets and mysteries are slowly the way that the mysteries and secrets are slowly unveiled and unlocked. And in fact, the unlocking and keys is one of the key pieces of imagery throughout the book, and it's done in a really beautiful way of things unspiraling. So Snake Ropes is set in an isolated island community. It's never quite made clear exactly when or where it's set. It's never quite made clear exactly where it's set. It follows the story of two teenage girls, Mary, who is a native islander and who is struggling to keep her family together after the death of her mother, in particular caring for her brother Barney and working to produce embroideries or broideries to support the family. And Morgan, who is a newcomer to the island, living isolated even from the isolated community with her parents and twin sisters, and their stories kind of intertwine throughout the book. They're both really interesting characters, showing a great deal of resilience in the face of very difficult circumstances, and that's one of the really appealing things about this book. They're also both very human and very flawed, and make mistakes, and they're both very questioning about who and what they can trust, and that's really fascinating. The language used by Mary is one of the things that slightly put me off when I started the book. The parts from her perspective are kind of written in a dialect that's not quite standard English, but does have its own internal grammatical rules, which, as I said, a little bit difficult to get into. But I found that it did work, and later on in the book it works really well to have that contrast between how she speaks and how the rest of her community speaks, and how outsiders to the island speak, and the usage of language. Which brings me on to another really interesting thing about this book, which is sort of exploration of language and literacy and the role that stories play in people's lives. And both the main characters absorb the narratives around them in order to almost create their own mythologies, and shape their understanding of events, and predict kind of what's going on and unravel those secrets. And that's really fascinating, particularly to have that contrast between one which is from a predominantly oral culture, and the other which, while being isolated away, has a stash of books of varying kinds, and that I found really fascinating. That question also comes into issues about gender politics, because one of the fascinating things about this island is that it's a situation in which men are generally not literate and it's not seen as useful for them to learn to read. But in a situation where culture is primarily oral and stories aren't written down, that has a very different set of consequences and meanings than it would in a predominantly more literate society, or a society where culture is predominantly more literate. So that's a really fascinating angle. Another key theme in this book is motherhood and the relationships between mothers and daughters. And I'm not going to do a full set of trigger warnings or content warnings for this book, but I would want to flag up that one of the families in this book, there is an abusive parent, and that might be something people want to consider when reading this book. And both girls struggle with the issue of trust in their mothers, on the question of unconditional love and the sacrifices that mothers make, but also the flaws and selfishness in families and how they work, and that's explored in a really lovely way. Very dark at times, and it doesn't kind of have a neat happy ending, but it does come to a satisfying conclusion. The book is in many ways very much a fantasy novel. There are lots of kind of fantastical elements, both in stories that are told by the characters to each other and what actually happens. In particular, there's the Thrashing House, which I won't go into too much detail, but is essentially an institution on the island that's bound up with the landscape and nature and is a form of punishment. And what goes on there and how things work there is very mystical and magical. And the magic in this book is often very dark and subversive. There's also some element of connecting magic and technology, because the technology of those outside of the island is not accessible to the community and there's not a real understanding. So there are certain things that are perceived as magic, which is sort of implied might actually be explained by science and technology. And it's another way that this novel plays with layers of knowledge in a really fascinating way. Another theme is the fallibility of memory, linking back to that idea of trust and relationships and narratives, and how we connect all those themes. And that's dealt with in a really interesting way. I particularly liked the relationship that's described between Mary and her grandmother, which is actually a really tender portrait of old age, kind of recognising that it recognises the potential loving relationship between an old person and a child without over romanticising that or falling back on stereotypes of the kind of the baking grandmother who produces delicious smelling apple pies and always remembers the birthday. It's very much not that, because there is this question of senility and mental illness, which is another thing that this book potentially needs a trigger warning for. Is there's one character in particular who is paranoid and possibly narcissistic, maybe, and maybe I'll cut that. With mental illness. In terms of other trigger warnings, there is violence throughout the book. In particular, there's one episode of sexual violence. One of the main things running throughout the book is this question of abduction of children. There are boys that have gone missing from the island, and that playing out might be something that, again, people want to consider before. That playing out might be, again, something that people want to consider before reading the book. But overall, it's something I would really recommend. I think I may have just listed the themes at you, but as you can tell, there's a very fascinating and interesting themes played out in really beautiful language. The really interesting descriptions of landscape with well-developed characters of not just the two main teenage girls that I've talked about, but also a kind of supporting cast around them of the minor characters. And it's a really interesting fantasy novel that doesn't just kind of present you with a mystical world, but explores what it means to create fantasy and what those narratives are, and what really is magical. So yeah, it's definitely something I would recommend reading if you can get hold of it. Snake Ropes by Jess Richards. And that was my first attempt at doing a vlog book review. So apologies if it was a bit rambly and made no sense, but thank you for watching, and hopefully I will be back again soon with another review. Thank you.